Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs, and all of you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. Once again, it is I, your sci-fi sommelier, your master of fun and wonder, your existential Mr. Rogers, and most importantly, your viceroy of verisimilitude, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I'm bringing you episode number 341 of Robservations, the show about something. And what that something is, I don't even know from day to day. I work hard trying to find fun things to talk about, and a lot of times you provide those fun things for me as well by sending me letters to the Burnettwork.net. And I'm always remiss. I always forget to mention, but we do have a very active Facebook page. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, there is a Post-Geek Singularity Facebook page, and I invite all of you gentle beings, if you're still on Facebook, that is, to come interact there. I promise only Facebook's gathering information about you. We are not. We're just celebrating all things, well, that imagination connoisseurs celebrate. So, yes, and once again, I do apologize for not being here yesterday. I missed yesterday and almost missed today, but I've been working. As some of you might know, I've been working on a project I can't talk about yet. It has not been. It's not because I'm cheeky and like, ooh, look at me. No, it just hasn't been officially announced. There are a lot of times where there are projects and things that are being made that you don't know about until they've been announced. And when they're announced, they're usually a long way down the line. As a matter of fact, I was doing work today, and again, I'm only putting a very, very small. My part in this project is extremely little, ensign, as Mr. Spock once said. But I'm very proud to be working on it, and it's something you will see in November of this year on a major streaming service. And it's pretty cool because it's in a realm that I have done little work in, and I'm quite enjoying it. So very much am proud and honored to work on this project, and I can't wait to tell you a little bit about it when it's further along. Also, if you live in Hollywood and you're interested in seeing Skyfighter, a short film on a big screen, I think it's the Holly Shorts Festival tomorrow night in Hollywood. We're part of a program that is screening at 9:30 at night. Lucas Kendall's short film that he wrote and directed that I edited, Skyfighter, is playing at that festival in Hollywood. So, how cool is that? I think it's pretty cool, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Now, just off the top today, there was something I found very interesting that I wanted to share with you, and it's an article that was in the Hollywood Reporter today. And it has some interesting ramifications, and I thought I'd share it with you now. This is again in the Hollywood Reporter today. It was published at almost noon Pacific time, so this article is not even 2 hours old. Movie studios back Oracle in Supreme Court fight over computer code. The Motion Picture Association, minus Netflix, surprisingly enough, argues that software is inherently different than works like movies and television shows. And so Google can't defend theft of code as transformative fair use. Wow. As entertainment charts a technological future where content is streamed to consumers, the industry's biggest studios have just weighed in on a Supreme Court case that will have outsized influence on the development of software interactivity. On Wednesday, all but one member of the Motion Picture Association filed arguments in support of Oracle, the tech giant aiming to punish Google for allegedly infringing computer code to build the Android operating system that's currently used on more than 2.5 billion mobile devices. Universal Pictures, Paramount Pictures, Walt Disney Studios, Warner Brothers, and Sony Pictures are staking out a protectionist stance in a dispute dubbed the copyright case of the century. But notably, the newest amicus brief comes without the assent of Netflix, which joined the Motion Picture Association just a year ago. The stakes of this battle to be argued at the Supreme Court on March 24th are hard to overstate. Some legal observers have quite credibly declared this case to be the most important copyright dispute ever heard by the High Court. Oracle is the owner of Java, a popular programming platform used to create apps for messaging, navigation, news, and social media. The computer language is open to developers who have used it to not only create useful apps, but also in a manner where these programs communicate with each other. Within the hierarchy of the Java API, there's declaring code and implementing code. To build Android more than a decade ago, Google relied heavily on pre-existing declarations familiar to programmers. More than 11,000 lines of code invoking basic computer functions, while rewriting the aspect of the software actually performing tasks. According to Google, declarations are like labels identifying drawers of a cabinet. Oracle has a different metaphor. Declarations are like topic sentences, while implementing code is akin to the body of paragraphs. Google may have thought it was escaping liability by bypassing Oracle's library of pre-written implementation code, but Oracle seeks $9 billion in damages for Google's reuse of the declaring code. In other words, Oracle claims protection in Java's intricate organization, which many computer scientists worry may make interoperability hard to achieve without a license. The first big question in this case pertains to the scope of the copyright. Google initially scored victory on this subject before that win was reversed on appeal. Copyright protects expression, not ideas, but under something called the merger doctrine, when there is a limited number of ways to express an idea, it's hard to separate the two. And in those circumstances, the expression is not protectable. Applying the merger doctrine, a district court judge ruled there could be no copyright violation in using declaring code given the finite ways to invoke a computer function. But the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, reasoning that Google could have written its own declaring code, even if doing so would be highly inefficient, held that merger was inapplicable. Oracle could indeed protect the structure, sequence, and organization of its application programming interfaces. Arguably, the Supreme Court's decision on the issue of scope could have ramifications for Hollywood. When the case gets argued before the justices next month, both sides are likely to employ plenty of metaphors and lean on a body of copyright precedent examining works of authorship like songs and movies. If the Supreme Court adopts a robust merger doctrine, that ruling may one day inform how future courts weigh cases involving everything from alleged script plagiarism to song theft. The inverse is true as well. As much as the outcome matters, so too does the High Court's reasoning in separating art from science, creativity from functionality. But that's not the aspect of this case that is of immediate concern for movie studios. Instead, the movie industry takes up the second question presented in this case, whether Google's use of a software interface constituted a fair use of copyright. At an earlier stage of this case, the district court pushed to trial the question of whether Google had infringed on Oracle's code. In 2016, a jury concluded that Google had not violated copyright because the defendant's use of the hierarchical structure of Java API was fair use. Hierarchical was fair use. That's a hard one. Accepting, among other things, Google's contention that it made transformative use of the code to create an innovative smartphone operating system, and that Android wasn't a market substitute for Oracle's code. On appeal, the Federal Circuit reversed this holding too, ruling that both Google and Oracle were in the commercial market and that Oracle could indeed show harm even if it wasn't yet in the smartphone business. The MPA, which used to be the MPAA, now it's the MPA, opines on what it sees as the proper application of the fair use defense, although it does so without Netflix. In a footnote, it's noted that the streamer takes no position here. The amicus brief, read in full here, goes pretty far in disclaiming any fair use when it comes to software code, which is protected under copyright law as a literary work. According to the movie studios, unlike purely expressive works, software by definition has a functional component that makes it inherently different. Applying the concept of transformation to partially non-expressive works like software is like trying to put the proverbial square peg into a round hole. Transformation, with its focus on new expression, meaning, or message, assumes an effect on a human thought or emotion. In contrast, software, in significant part, operates independently of such human thought and emotion. It's added that Google is attempting to defend its transformative use of code by pointing to its innovative product. This is the future, man. I read this stuff and I'm like, we talk about first world problems. These are definitely first world problems, and I love them because these are very, very important things to understand. Because eventually, ladies and gentlemen, these kinds of decisions are going to be applied to biology. And that's when it's going to start to get really interesting. And manufactured, whatever it is, any kind of biotech that's manufactured using, like, can you copyright certain uses with DNA? It's going to be really interesting. Google's approach not only lacks any precedent and is inapt, its purported new exception swallows the rule, respond the movie studios. The unintended consequences of applying legal concepts developed in fair use cases involving purely expressive works to a software case like this one, especially in the radical manner advocated by Google, could cause a seismic shift away from long-established law and legitimate marketplace expectations. The harmful consequences would be felt not only in the instant case but also across the creative industries should the resulting analysis be inappropriately applied to future cases involving traditional, purely expressive works. In other words, the entertainment industry doesn't want copyright infringement of motion pictures and television programs to be excused purely because the resulting work is deemed to have some social value. This position is well beyond what the movie industry previously put forth at the federal circuit. There, the MPA only looked at the fourth factor governing fair use, the effect of use upon the potential market, and wanted to ensure that just because a Hollywood studio or any copyright holder hasn't exploited its work somewhere doesn't mean they wouldn't eventually do so. The latest brief has echoes of that argument too. In today's era of rapid changes in technologies and business models, potential markets can and do quickly become actual markets, state the movie studios, represented by Robert Rothstein, Eleanor Lackman, and other attorneys at Mitchell, Silberg, and Knupp, as a means of encouraging copyright owners to create and disseminate new works in new ways. The Copyright Act protects copyright owners' rights to develop those new markets. To dismiss harm to such potential markets in the fourth factor analysis contravenes the purposes of copyright law. The MPA isn't the only group to file amicus briefs in support of Oracle. Also today came ones from the Association of American Publishers, Journalism Law Professors, and the News Media Alliance. Also not to be missed is Dolby Laboratories, which says it spent $240 million last year on technology, including surround sound programs installed in movie theaters, and that stripping technology companies of the historical copyright afforded such works would undermine the entire industry's incentive structure. Among the groups and corporations lining up on Google's side is the Center for Democracy and Technology, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, IBM, and Microsoft. Before Netflix joined the MPA, it was a member of the Internet Association. Along with the Computer and Communications Association, this trade group warns that if the Supreme Court doesn't reverse the lower appellate court, it will represent a major setback to technological innovation. The interoperability enabled by this legal regime has led to a dizzying pace of innovation and consumer choice, states the tech industry's brief. Unfortunately, the Federal Circuit's decisions in this case have disrupted this stable legal environment. Anyway, I find myself fascinated by cases like this. Now, I don't presume to understand all the ins and outs of all of this. But from what I understand, so Oracle wrote this initial code, and it allows other people to make, you can make things talk to each other. But ultimately, you're still using Oracle's initial code, and they did create it. It wasn't like it was created as this open source medium by somebody who just wanted to, some designer, some code writer who created this and let anybody use it. It was created by Oracle. And now I understand that by using what they've created, you can apparently transform. It's transformative to a certain extent, but ultimately the underlying code, let's just call it an idea, belongs to Oracle. Now, once, of course, it starts being used and you've got 2.5 billion smartphones using this thing that allows communication and interactivity and throughout your operating system, of course you're going to fight it. Who wants to pay for that? But it's very interesting. It's very interesting to me because who owns things? It goes back to the conversation that I was having about, look, as many people know, I was involved in the Axanar project for a while. We made the fan film Prelude to Axanar, but it all went awry when we were actually sued. Well, Alec Peters, the creator of the Axanar property, was sued, or the creator of the Axanar concept that was based obviously on Star Trek, which is owned by CBS. And he was in a copyright battle that I was peripherally involved with. I certainly was deposed. I've talked about that before. But, I find the whole thing very, very interesting. And in a way, it's very strange. We now have these multinational corporations that own these IPs that, as I said, sort of infect us, whether it's Star Wars, Star Trek. I mean, I was infected at a very young age by the science fiction, fantasy, horror bug, and specifically Star Trek. And I spent an inordinate amount of my life thinking about Star Trek. And by the way, I still do. So what does that mean? But it doesn't really mean anything. Paramount, CBS now owns Star Trek. Now I guess it's co-owned now because they've been merged again after the bifurcation that happened in 2005 is no longer, and they're together again. But what's really, really interesting is that, I mean, it's such a weird idea. It's like Cronenberg. I've talked a little bit about David Cronenberg wrote a script called Crimes of the Future about a crime division, a law enforcement division that is investigating things that are so far beyond today that they have yet to be classified as crimes. And I've always thought, I mean, as somebody who loves science fiction, there are a lot of things that are going to be coming down the pike. A lot of it has to do with bioethics, I think, that we are just not ready for. Certainly not as a society, and the legal and ethical ramifications of what our technology is going to allow us to do as humans. It's going to be very interesting. And I guess because I was adopted, the idea of bioethics has always been sort of ingrained into me. Maybe it was just being a science fiction fan and also being adopted. I've always been fascinated by anything to do with these kinds of questions. And in terms of software questions, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, we have, as innovation occurs and people start using original code to do things that no one even thought about at the time, they hadn't even conceived of them yet, but then later on figure out applications. I mean, don't we want to continue or encourage that kind of innovation? And, sometimes, well, if we have to pay a license, we better not do that. And then the innovation goes away. I mean, I completely understand that. But that doesn't mean that Oracle didn't, in fact, create this code. Who knew what it was going to be used for later? But it's very interesting. So I just, you guys are probably like already tired of me hear about me talking about this kind of stuff. But I do find these questions to be fascinating. And, I enjoy contemplating what they all might mean. Well, today's topic, actually was suggested to me by, it was a letter. It was a letter. And this letter comes from Christopher Whitfield. And he writes, Connoisseurs. The new Star Wars sequel trilogy was a movie series that was produced without direction, produced without logic, produced without a destination. When embarking on such a momentous journey, or a monstrous journey, one of so much expectation and financial investment, you'd think there would be a map, some kind of plan or outline. If anything, the Star Wars sequel trilogy did not. While considering my thoughts and opinions of the 3 Star Wars sequel, I parallel them with the making of The Lord of the Rings. The Peter Jackson trilogy was probably the most desired and anticipated movie series outside of Star Wars. The Tolkien fans are just as numerous and possibly just as judgmental and opinionated. The trilogy was a massive undertaking, beginning with with convincing a studio that they weren't investing in 1 movie, but 3. In Jackson's mind, there was no conceived way to adapt the first book and hope it was a success, and hopefully get the green light to have a shot at the second or third books. He was going to make all 3 movies, or none at all. So what did Jackson do once he knew he was going to make a Lord of the Rings trilogy of films? He spent years researching, reading, and adapting and planning. The books were meticulously adapted into the 3 screenplays. Those screenplays would continue to evolve to best convey the story cinematically. It goes without saying that adapting novels for the silver screen is difficult. Even in this venture, he had to rearrange scenes and add elements to provide a great movie-going experience. Sometimes these changes irritated the fanatic readers of the book series. I was going to say Tom Bombadil. But Jackson had a plan. He even shot the movies all at once. There were days in 1999 or 2000 when shooting included scenes for Fellowship, Return of the King, and Two Towers. There were sets being built for the Two Towers and while Fellowship of the Rings was still in production. The monumental task of the film series was too great for Peter Jackson not to spearhead the entire creative process. He knew that if the films were going to appear visually similar, he had to direct all 3 of them. He knew if the story was going to hold up, he needed to take charge of the continuity and the writing process. He wasn't only responsible for the creative direction of the movies, he was responsible for the financial success too. He also wore the hat of chief financial officer. There were hundreds of millions of dollars at risk, and he knew it. So I think about Disney's approach to their recent investment, and most likely the most important and infamous franchise of all time, Star Wars. A new trilogy was obvious. Yet unlike the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Disney and Lucasfilm threw out all previous expanded universe materials. Only film and television productions were now official canon. They didn't look to the thousands of books and comics as inspiration, but insisted that new Star Wars needed a fresh slate so it could be creatively rewarding. It's not contested that the MCU films were not direct translations of specific comics, but it's evident they were used to inspire the writing of those films. So, why did Lucasfilm decide their vast library and resources were no longer important? Unlike Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, Disney and Lucasfilm decided to create each film separately. J.J. Abrams was brought on board to write and direct the first film. Lucasfilm would then award the other 2 films to other directors. Those directors would be responsible for writing or commissioning a script and create a film without consulting the prior film's creative staff. This seemed reckless for such a financial investment. Why wasn't there a film Bible, Force Commandments, or a stone tablet with the sequel trilogy outline? 3 directors could have worked and most likely been fine, but there should have been 3 scripts completed before production started. There should have been an absolute projection of where the story and characters were going. Instead, we got the opposite. We got a trilogy made up on the fly. We were told no director would agree to the job if they couldn't make the movie their own. Before the criticism of that's how the original trilogy was filmed debate begins, let's agree that this was a completely different set of circumstances. George Lucas wasn't even sure he'd get an opportunity to shoot a sequel or a trilogy for that matter, yet I'm pretty sure he knew the beginning and end of the prequel trilogy before he started writing Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So consider what if. What if Lord of the Rings had been greenlit by New Line Cinema with 3 directors along with their own unique screen adaptations of the book they were assigned? What if those movies were injected with the director's own interpretations of the source material or decided to take a hard turn for the sake of cinematic and creative storytelling? Would those movies have been a success? Would they have been such a passionate and honest love letter to Tolkien's masterpiece? Would they still be talked about today? Or even rewatched by millions to this day? I don't think so. Sincerely, CW. Well, as you can see, there's a lot to unpack there. And having worked on the extended edition, DVDs that are now Blu-rays of Lord of the Rings, I spent a long time, over 2 years of my life, sort of immersed in the making of Lord of the Rings. I was certainly down in New Zealand while Return of the King was being finished. And I watched stuff being shot, and I saw what was going on. Now, here's something that people forget. Peter Jackson originally conceived the Lord of the Rings trilogy as 2 films that he was going to make with Miramax. It was going to be 2 movies. And it was always going to be 2 movies. They were never going to make 3 movies, even though there are indeed 3 Lord of the Rings novels, as we all know. Eventually, and what went on, not only was Peter Jackson and Fran and Philippa, his collaborators, Fran is his life partner and Philippa is their very good friend, Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, and they were all working on this together, but they were always going to make 2 movies. But also the Weta Workshop was working on creating, designing. Weta Digital was basically being formed, the beginnings of how they were going to do all of these things. And what was really interesting about this whole project is, remember, in New Zealand, there wasn't a lot of production going on. Peter Jackson, there was people like Jeff Murphy, who was a second unit director on Lord of the Rings. He'd made movies like Utu, which was great, and Quiet Earth, and there were movies that were coming out of New Zealand like Once Were Warriors, Lee Tamahori, who later went on to direct a James Bond movie. So New Zealand, while it certainly wasn't Hollywood, it wasn't unheard of for a small 2-island nation to be making movies. There was this small film, very, very tight-knit film community in New Zealand, and the idea of making Lord of the Rings, people the Beatles were going to star in a version of Lord of the Rings at one point. So Miramax was going to make this, and then they eventually said, no, we're not going to make it. And basically what they told Peter Jackson is there was a lot of development money already spent, so Peter Jackson not only had to find another studio to make Lord of the Rings, he had to find somebody to cover, to basically pay back what Miramax had paid. I think it was the tune of $50 million. So this was a Herculean task, and the way it was explained to us, the DVD team, and well, I don't know if the story appears, I don't remember, but Peter Jackson tells the story of how he had seen all of the studios, and he was basically had one last stop, and that was Bob Shaye at New Line. And he had this 5-minute reel that showed everything that they had been developing and making and everything. And so Peter Jackson had dealings with Bob Shaye in the past, and they had a relationship. So Peter Jackson went and saw Bob Shaye and presented this reel. And when it was over, and this is the question that I most wanted answered in my entire time working on Lord of the Rings, and we didn't really interview Bob Shaye. He doesn't appear on the discs, but maybe he appears on Return of the King. I don't remember. But basically, when Peter Jackson made his presentation, when the lights came up, Bob Shaye said, "Well, wait a minute, aren't there 3 Lord of the Rings books?" And basically that was the moment they were sort of off to the races. But as our man CW points out, what Lord of the Rings had that Star Wars didn't necessarily have, even with all of the EU and all the material, was you had the books. You had Lord of the Rings, and you had an outline. You had a story that was already laid out for you. And it makes sense. It would not have made sense because not only is Lord of the Rings 3 books, it's really one story. And that story, it wouldn't have made sense to bring on other directors that are putting their imprimatur on things, because you first and foremost are serving Tolkien's story. So what they eventually did with Lord of the Rings was, of course, they shot all 3 movies at once. But famously, each film had what they call, let's call it pickups for lack of a better term, but their pickups for each movie lasted longer than the production schedules of most feature films. So they made the 3 movies. They were very iterative. Lord of the Rings was a very iterative process where they were able to go in and famously reshoot things and change things up until the very end. I was surprised during the editorial process of The Two Towers, they really didn't have an ending. For instance, the Ents attacking Isengard was not in the movie. And I think in the book it has a cursory mention, but they turned it in while they were scoring the movie in London. They decided to do this. And Peter Jackson, because he basically ended up owning all of the infrastructure that was built to make the movies in a very, very smart move, Weta Workshop, Weta Digital, he could do whatever he wanted, which really helped those movies. It wasn't just the creative genius that Peter Jackson had himself, and Philippa and Fran, and also all the people like Roger Taylor and everybody that was working at Weta. They were all amazing. So they could think stuff up and work on the fly. They were very nimble. If they wanted to create things, they could do that. So the way the Lord of the Rings movies made, there was never anything in Hollywood before or since. I mean, you could say that the Hobbit movies were made in the same way, but that, yes, and they were, but even that was a little bit different because that infrastructure then already existed. They already kind of had a roadmap of what to do, but in this case, they didn't. And it's interesting that The Hobbit started out as it was going to be 2 movies and then morphed into 3, which is kind of exactly what happened with Lord of the Rings too. But when you have that kind of working the way, and by the way, knowing the executives at New Line, not Bob Shea, but other people, the other execs at New Line there's one in particular, he lost his hair, he'll tell you. I mean, when we were cutting our behind the scenes documentaries, he would come in and pop in and see what we were doing, and he would talk about that and how difficult it was to make sure that it all happened. And it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare for a motion picture studio the way that they were working, because Peter Jackson would push. I mean, literally, when things were due at the 11th hour, Peter Jackson would go get that 12th hour. And for a studio that needs to hit all these dates, it was not a way that any studio wanted to work, because sure, it was not that they were irresponsible, but it was that process. Like, they were not going to just give it up. It wasn't going to be, well, that's good enough. No. When they were making Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson would push until he had it exactly the way he wanted it, and it drove New Line crazy. And I mean, it all worked out. It all came out in the wash, but the studio would not. It's not the way movies should have been made. It did work, and it worked beautifully. And I do think that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is easily the most satisfying trilogy in all of cinema history, because it was made at once, and I agree, it would not have worked right. Now, there are still things that Tolkien purists might not like. For instance, the lack of Tom Bombadil, which I completely understand. And then another big one is the conclusion of Return of the King. If you've never read the books, imagine this. Okay, imagine if after throwing the ring into the crack of doom and destroying the One Ring, imagine that our Hobbit heroes, Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin, arrive back in their beloved Shire only to find it a industrialized hellhole. And you find out that Saruman and Grima Wormtongue had basically enslaved the population of the Shire and turned them into a bunch of industrial workers, and the Shire had been destroyed. And in the book, it's called the Scouring of the Shire. Imagine if that's how it ended. Imagine if people would have been berserk. Audiences would have been like, fuck you. No way. What? So they made changes. And I know some Tolkien purists are like, rah, rah, rah. I get it. I understand. But there are realities when you're making a movie. And after 3 movies, if you were going to have your heroes return to find their hometown ravaged by a secondary villain, it wouldn't have worked. So there were out of necessity, there were changes that were made to the story that needed to be made. All that said, Peter Jackson and the geniuses in New Zealand were able to make, I don't think there's ever been, and I know when I say this, people might not get what I'm trying to say, but I think that the Lord of the Rings trilogy is one of the most handcrafted group of films ever. And when I mean handcrafted, it really feels like you can see that individual human beings contributed to every frame. It really felt, if a movie can feel handmade, which is sort of a weird idea, but Lord of the Rings was handmade. And when I said it, yes, I know it was shot with cameras, and I get all that. But in terms of everybody, all hands on deck, and it's basically almost the antithesis of how a Hollywood movie is made, because if they needed to throw up a green screen and get a picture of a horse rearing back, they could do it. If they needed to like run out and be like, hey, you know what, we need to go get this aerial shot, they'd call up one of the helicopter jockeys and be like, guys, can we go out there and shoot this shot for the Flames of Gondor or whatever? They could get whatever they wanted. They could do whatever they wanted. You know, here, when you make a movie in Hollywood, every penny is accounted for. So you have to understand that while I think on one hand, the Lord of the Rings movies are a perfect example of how to make franchise films, they are not necessarily a great example of how Hollywood makes films. Now, what I do agree with CW here is that the conception, Lord of the Rings had the books. They had the books. And that is the lesson. The lesson is the material that they wanted to turn into a film was already known beforehand. And it's strange to me, and I look, you have to understand that Hollywood studios, the way movies are made within the Hollywood system, they are not set up to make multiple movies at once. As many people know, and the show will soon be back up on my website, but it won't be here because I had to pull it down because of Warner Brothers. I reported on the Dune Screenplay. And I thought it was excellent. I really loved the John Spates, Eric Roth, and Denis Villeneuve draft of the Dune Screenplay that has been put into production. But it's only half the book. If Dune doesn't work, you'll never get the climax of at least the first story of the first book. So they're only making half of Dune. Now, the last two iterations that we've seen of Dune, both David Lynch's version and the TV version, packed all of that into their running time to varying degrees of success. But the movie that we're getting at the end of this year in December is the first half of Dune. Now, I get it. From a production standpoint, making one movie is hugely expensive. But making two movies, not knowing whether or not you're going to receive or get a return on your investment, how do you justify that? If you're a publicly held company, Warner Brothers certainly is, how are they supposed to say, yeah, we're going to make two of these movies, and what if the first one doesn't work? I mean, they might have been able to make multiple movies with the Harry Potter books, but that was because they knew their audience that was reading these Harry Potter books was also the primary movie-going audience. Dune is based on a book that came out in 1965, and David Lynch's last theatrical version of Dune, the only theatrical version of Dune that was released, came out in 1984. So, what is this audience? It's a crapshoot. Also, Denis Villeneuve, who obviously has made two fine science fiction films with Arrival and Blade Runner 2049, is a world-class talent who really knows how to world build and create great science fiction cinema. But even then, it's not like, how do you justify? Remember, movie studios are not sitting on vaults of cash just waiting to spend them on movies. Movie studios are borrowing that money. They're borrowing the money they use to make movies from banks. And banks immediately, the interest rates are clicking, the interest charges are clicking up. And you have to be able to show a return. They've got models how long it takes, how until the loan is going to be paid back, and there's all kinds of financial models that go into making motion pictures. So, let's say you're Disney and you're going to make a Star Wars movie. You buy Star Wars for $4 billion. $4 billion for the amount of money we talk about. Everyone seems, well, Disney made $11 billion last year. Disney has operating costs. It seems like it's a lot of money, but in Hollywood, it's really not. It's not as much money as you might think. Now, that being said, they made a heck of a lot of money last year, more money than any other studio has made in a year. So they're sitting pretty. But they already spent $4 billion on Star Wars, which means not only do they have to figure out a way to pay that $4 billion back, after that money was spent, once they're the custodians of Star Wars, until it starts paying money back to them, there's more money being spent. So you're racking up more money on development costs of whatever it is you're going to do with Star Wars. You've got to figure out what is Lucasfilm like. It's not just the $4 billion that they spent on it, it's the money they're continuing to spend once they've acquired it. So there's a lot of money that is going out Disney's door. Now, it would seem prudent that, yes, okay, well, maybe, because you think there's something called amortizing costs across. This is what I don't understand about Dune. If you're going to make Dune, and basically the first half of Dune, it jumps around, but the latter half is predominantly set on Arrakis in one place. When you have built all your sets and you've paid all your actors, in my mind, it would seem to be more prudent just to film the whole thing to amortize the costs. But again, I'm not making these financial decisions. But in the case of Dune, maybe they'll save those sets. But since you're on location, you're in Jordan or wherever the hell you're filming. You're on location. Shoot it out. Shoot everything you need. That's what I would have done. But then again, I haven't seen the books. I don't know what everybody's getting paid. But with Star Wars, look, for us, it seems silly that we've now had 2 trilogies of Star Wars movies. Disney buys Star Wars, that they're not going to plan out a trilogy. But I'm telling you, there is nothing that is analogous in the way Disney has ever done business in the movie industry that would allow them to take that kind of a risk. Even Infinity War and Endgame, look what that you're looking at those films. You had 21 and 22 films, or maybe it was the 20th and the 22nd film, because you had Black Panther and you had Captain America come out or something. You still had a huge track record. They knew those movies, after looking at the financials, probably weren't that much of a risk. And indeed, based on what they earned, they were not a risk at all. But believe it or not, when Star Wars was purchased by Disney, it was all still a risk. You think it isn't a risk. You think it's a no-brainer, right? We as fans can think that way. But you can't when you're at a studio and you've already spent $4 billion. Bob Iger knew that he was eventually going to pay it back. But as we have seen by what's happened with Star Wars, it has never been that easy. And the scrutiny and the pressure is on. But I completely agree that if you already know that you're planning on making a trilogy of movies, in the case of Star Wars, and having all that material, some of my lights just fell down. I understand. I get it. The problem is Hollywood is just not built to do that, to have that, to have that kind of a risk, just to take it on. And in the case of Lord of the Rings, it was a unique situation because you had a filmmaker, you had an entire country behind the makers of that movie, and everybody in New Zealand was willing to. The people there are salt of the earth anyway. They tell you they can fix anything with baling wire and duct tape, and indeed they probably can. You literally had a country of people that were willing to help. They really were. And in Hollywood, you just don't get that. Everybody wants to get paid, and they have to make sure. But yes, I don't understand why, if you're going to get into the business of franchise filmmaking, and especially if there's a no-brainer like Star Wars, if there's a no-brainer, a franchise like that, you owe it to yourself. And indeed, people forget. People forget with the Duel of the Fates script that I first reported on here on this channel. With that Duel of the Fates script, Colin Trevorrow was, in fact, basing what he was doing on what had come before. J.J. Abrams, when he made Force Awakens, set the tone. Rian Johnson had to pick up what was done, and then Colin Trevorrow was going to finish it all off. Now, they were sort of working. They knew what each other was doing. But I would have gone even further. I mean, I think that that storyline should have been developed, and I agree. The reason that I think the Star Wars prequel trilogy or sequel trilogy will forever be considered a disappointment is how, especially in this day and age, in the post-Lord of the Rings world, and remember, I know we had books helping us out, and interestingly enough, in the Star Wars now Legends universe, but in the extended universe, they had already told the story of what happened post-Return of the Jedi. It was already there. And that, to me, is, I think, the most baffling of all. But, as it has been explained to me a number of times, people in Hollywood, they frown. They look upon those things as being, oh, those aren't real. You know, filmmakers didn't do that. You know, you basically had fans writing novels. We're not going to... And it's interesting because I don't think that there's anything that we saw in all three of the sequel Star Wars movies that was better than what we already got in the EU. Now, I'm not saying the EU was perfect. The extended universe was not perfect by any means, but certainly all the groundwork was there. You know, there was enough to be, whether you started with the Thrawn trilogy and the Dark Empire comics, you could start there and come up with a pretty satisfying three movies. But Star Wars is pretty much like the only franchise. I mean, it's frustrating to me as a Bond fan that they've basically made the entire Daniel Craig Bond movies into one story. And after the MCU, after they saw that success, you know, let's tie in Skyfall and Spectre, and now we're gonna have the end of this. It's now a 5-movie arc that I thought it doesn't work really really well, especially when the Bond franchise was never like that, and it was all retconned anyway to work that way. But most Hollywood studios do not have the luxury of that kind of pre-planning. I think ultimately, in the case of Star Wars, they should have. But again, even Star Wars, it seems it's easy for us to say, no-brainer, but it is certainly in practice not something that the Hollywood studios are set up to do. I think they should do it that way. I really do. And indeed, we see it in television. You know, all the great TV shows are pre-planned. They're like, okay, here's our arc. Not necessarily done as well as they should have. I won't mention any names. But hey, we're going to see more of it tomorrow, right? But it seems like it's a no-brainer. But in the business of Hollywood, to be able to pre-plan a trilogy of films is a luxury most studios simply cannot afford. So, yeah. Anyway, that's just what I was thinking about. And let's see what you guys are thinking about. And by the way, I do have more letters. Let's see. I'm going to have to let me just put my glasses on to read. Porg Hub. This is something I got in yesterday that I didn't, I wasn't on yesterday. So Porg Hub says, is there a master plan for the Bonnie Somerville trade? She has a reputation of not showing up to anything she commits to. By the way, I love your Schmodown character. It's such a huge departure from your demeanor on Robservations. # Burning Drews. Well, Porg Hub, thank you for that. For those of you who might not know, for the last, 3 or 4 years, I've been involved with Christian Harloff and Mark Ellis's The Movie Trivia Schmodown. For those of you who might not know what that is, it is a movie trivia game that is sort of based around wrestling, professional wrestling. I know it sounds silly, but when you watch it, you see. And there are movie trivia battles, trivia contests, and the trivia contests are very real. The game is very real. It's also hard and very stressful. And I just started doing it when I was at Collider. I was asked to do it. I was doing it with John Schnepp and John Campia years ago for fun. And it was what we just knew off the top of our heads. And I was actually the first inner geekdom champion. But then as it started to gain in popularity and more people started to watch it and it was garnering more fans, it became, and new players came in and old players became champions, it became much more difficult to play and people started to study. I'm like, I can't study. So as a player, I didn't do well as the new players were coming up. So I become a manager. And what was interesting is when I started, I was just doing it as me. But now I have a persona called the captain that is, it's an act. The game is not an act, but the personas that people take on, just like in wrestling, there's something called kayfabe that is, it is the reality. I guess for wrestling, kayfabe would be the equivalent of verisimilitude or non-verisimilitude. And I've been playing this I was told to be a heel, and a heel in wrestling is there's faces and there's heels. And I wanted to be a villain, so I play this character that's loud and egomaniacal and brash, and I yell and scream a lot. And so, yes, I want to thank you for being supporting the me. And the master plan for Bonnie Somerville, you know, I don't know her, to be honest, but I thought we would be a good fit. I thought, if nothing else, she could be my co-manager. I don't know if she'll show up to these things or not. Bonnie Somerville was an actress. She's appeared on a lot of TV shows and things like Friends, and she definitely understands the theatricality, and I think for me, I needed somebody that could perhaps manage in my stead, and that's why I chose to draft her. Also because Video Drew was on my ass, and everybody wanted me to trade her. No, see, I should say that my team is considered the lowest. Like, I'm considered a joke, really. But we'll see. That's all I'm going to say. I think people's they're quick to judge. But Porghub, I'll keep the faith. Hashtag my team, by the way, I called them the Burning Droogs. I got my droog behind my shoulder. Our team are the Burning Droogs. And I like to say on the Schmodown that I'm going to Burnett it all down. So there you go. Willow sends in a tip. Which country's accents do you find to be the sexiest? I got addicted to Mads Mikkelsen's Danish, you were correct, Danish, accent from watching Hannibal. If I had an AI assistant like in Her, I'd want to have his voice. Well, I find most accents pretty sexy. I love Spanish, like people that are from Catalan. I love the Catalan accent. French is always good. French is a very sexy accent. But I love Italian accents as well. I even like German accents. Pretty much anybody who has a foreign accent. And I really like Australian and Kiwi accents as well, even though it's just English. I guess when you're talking about accents, people speaking in English, I've always been attracted to foreigners, just in general. You just assume that when people have accents, they're smarter than you, even though that's a ridiculous thing to say. But yeah, I mean, the Romance languages mostly Spanish, Italian, French. I also find the Dutch accent sexy, and I've been to Copenhagen and also the Danish accents. You know, there's not many accents I don't like. I mean, I was in South Korea in 2018. I really liked hearing the Korean accent. You know, I just find it interesting. So, but yeah, Danish, that's a pretty good one. James Ito sent in a super chat and said, I had a dream a few nights ago that I watched a Clockwork Orange sequel made by Monty Python. It was a very trippy experience. I don't know, maybe Monty Python did a Clockwork Orange sketch. I don't know if they did, but maybe they did. I think that you have a subconscious mind that I can, at least I definitely think your subconscious mind and I park our subconscious shuttlecrafts on the same subconscious shuttle bay. So good there. Richard Ford sent in a tip and said, thanks for giving my letter airtime yesterday. Enjoyed your comments and perspective. Keep up the great work. Well, Richard, thank you for tipping. Thanks for supporting the channel. And I'm glad that, look, I mean, one of the things that's made this channel obviously the best it can be is all of the input, sharing all the opinions of the Post-Geek Singularity. I think that's what people tune in to hear, and we've been building this community, and I think that's what the best thing ever is sharing all of your ideas. So thanks for writing in. Keep up those letters coming in. Happy Console Gamers sent in a super chat saying, "Hey, I sent you a message on Twitter asking, will Free Enterprise ever get a Blu-ray release, or is it too expensive to do?" No, I've been in the last couple of years actively trying to do that. I would love nothing more. It unfortunately making a what I would do. My goal is to do. First of all, there are two things. Yes, I want to make a 4K version of Free Enterprise, and I want to obviously put it out on both Blu-ray and 4K. I also would like to do my final cut of the movie that I'd call the Final Frontier cut. There's just things I've learned, things I'd like to do to make it better. So I'm hoping to do that. That's one of my goals in 2020. I hope to be able to achieve that goal. I think there's a lot of people that would be interested in it. Free Enterprise is sort of a forgotten geek movie, and I get that question literally every day, so I'm hoping to make it available on all platforms. So, yeah. I thank you for asking. And thank you for supporting the channel. Stubble McShave sent in a tip and said, "I think it's interesting that some scenes between Frodo and Sam were filmed 2 years apart, where the coverage of one character was done in pickups." I mean, that's one of the amazing things about the Lord of the Rings movies. You know, even like the end of Two Towers, when Sam is at the stone window, he's literally narrating the end of the movie as you see a montage of everything that's going on. That was all added late in post. And that's what I mean by they were very iterative. They did many different things to make those movies. They never compromised. They constantly were changing them and making them as good as they can be. Again, that's not that's not how a studio works either. So they were able to do that. I mean, they were overseen by New Line, but really it was that Kiwi ingenuity, and it was Peter Jackson's unwillingness to compromise that made those movies what they are. And I'll tell you something. It was an epic win for New Line, an epic win for Warner Brothers. Look what happens when you allow somebody who really knows what they're doing and has a vision, and more importantly, has the team surrounding them to realize that vision. That's what's most important. That's the lesson to be taken from studios. And unfortunately, I don't know if movie studios even have... They hold such tight reins. We see what happened with Suicide Squad. Studios get into things, and the problem that I think that even New Line, as far as the studio is concerned, you basically had they were a small enough studio that if it was a larger studio, they probably wouldn't have let Peter Jackson get away with it. But I find it interesting that a lot of the gatekeepers and a lot of the executives at the studios have never made movies, so they don't anticipate on a daily basis what can and can't be done in production-wise to solve problems and things. So it's tough to do that. They were lucky they had New Line. Grant Kelbrick sent in a super chat saying, "Rob, I can handle losing Star Wars. Star Trek is really hurting right now, but if they screw up Lord of the Rings, I don't think I can recover. What is your gut feeling about the Amazon venture?" You know what? I feel pretty good about it. I think that they will take, whether you like the Hobbit movies or not, and I know for me, tonally, they were kind of all over the place, but still, you know, you still had New Zealand. They went back to New Zealand. I know they were talking about going to Ireland, and let's face it, you think they're not going to lean heavily on Weta Workshop and Weta Digital? So many of those assets. Look, what does a great television producer do? Who you amortize, again, everything you can to cut down the costs of your show. Well, I understand that The Lord of the Rings takes place thousands of years before the movies do, and that the movie is leading up to the battle that we saw at the beginning of Fellowship, when Galadriel is telling us about the history of Middle-earth. That was the end of the Second Age that we see at the beginning of the movie. So I think that it's important that they've now gone to a place where Middle-earth, they can make use of assets that previously exist. That is what a smart TV producer does. And they use, like, when you're creating certain assets, and you see a little bit of that. Like, look, even Star Trek is making use of Discovery assets, or Picard is, even though it makes no sense. I understand why they're doing it. But I think that the Amazon Lord of the Rings series is going to be a very worthy effort. They have really a lot of great people working on the show, and I think we're going to get something very, very special because they have to. And they spent, remember, just for the rights, they spent $250 million. So I know as far as Amazon's concerned, that probably feels like a drop in the bucket, but it isn't. That's a lot of money. A lot of money. So I've got some, let's see, I got some letters. Let's see if that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. Let me go back here and see if I can get other letters. Now you can see, I will go back. And I'm going to read this one. This one comes from Amir B. And I love this. Hi, Rob. I'm writing to you to share my thoughts on one of my favorite movies of all time. The serial killer subgenre within crime movies is one of my absolute favorite types of movies, and has had many great movies over the years, from Zodiac and American Psycho to The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and, of course, Silence of the Lambs. However, I want to talk about the one which I think is still the best of this subgenre to date, Seven. Fincher's first directorial effort after the Alien 3 disaster. It's the type of movie that, as I grow older, I just appreciate it more. The movie has all the factors that go into a great movie. Great performances, a gripping story, excellent writing, and so on. But there are things about Seven that push it to the top of my list in this subgenre for me. To borrow a phrase from you, it's a movie that is not only peak verisimilitude, it's also peak stylization, a phrase that I may only use for Prisoners and True Detective Season 1. I know Fincher's movies always have a style, but everything in this movie is unsettling. The camera shots, the editing, the production design, there's even a sense of dread within that weather. The entire movie, except for the final scenes, it's raining. On top of that, Fincher handles the kills and violence masterfully. As unsettling the movie is, it's not as gory as many of the current movies in this genre. Fincher never goes overboard with the violence. In some cases, he shows the dead bodies, and at other times, he just suggests what happened. Another thing about Seven is you don't see any of these murders being committed. You see them after the fact. And also, the final scene, you don't see what could have been one of the most horrific things in the whole movie. You don't see it. You're only told about it. Ironically, the most unsettling kill for me was the one regarding lust. I don't know if you remember it or not. Oh, I do remember it. Someone just describes what happens in an interrogation room, and all we see is the murder weapon, and what a murder weapon it is. And if you haven't seen Seven, first of all, what's wrong with you? It's I would consider it's not just a crime thriller, but it is a horror film, I think. I really do think it's a horror movie, and it works on so many different levels, and like you, I think it's one of the great, if not the greatest film in its genre. It's certainly right up there. I love Seven. I will spare you once again with the story about how I read the screenplay of it, but 5 years before it was made, and it was the first and only script I ever said yes to back in 1990 when I was reading scripts for a living. The movie has an opening credit. I love opening credits and can't remember when the last time was I saw a big movie with credits, except Bond to have a credit scene like that, but Seven has the best use of an opening credit scene I've ever seen in my life. During it, they show everyone's name except Kevin Spacey. When the movie ends, his name is the first to appear. If memory serves, the opening credits for Seven were done by Kyle Cooper at Imaginary Forces, which is a company in Hollywood. I think they're still around. I think Seven is one of the greatest opening credit sequences in any movie ever made. I'm a huge fan of opening credit sequences. They can be art forms unto themselves. And I remember once David Cronenberg talking about his love of opening credit sequences because they really set the mood for you. Another favorite credit sequence of mine was Dead Ringers, Cronenberg's own Dead Ringers, when you see various medical drawings, and it's very interesting. And I can't wait. Daniel Kleinman, who does the Bond opening credits, he took over for Maurice Binder, and he has been doing the opening Bond credit sequences since 1995's GoldenEye. He did skip Quantum of Solace, and I don't like the opening credits in Quantum of Solace that much. They're not bad, but they're a little, I don't know, not nearly as dynamic as what Kleinman has been doing. And I'm really looking forward to what Daniel Kleinman's credits look like in No Time to Die. For someone like me who saw the movie Cold the first time and knew Spacey, seeing him as the killer was shocking to say the least. To this day, no killer reveal has been this surprising, a surprise to be sure, but a welcome one, laugh out loud. Finally, the majority of the third act is just a back-and-forth conversation between Pitt and Spacey. This is just mesmerizing, not only considering the movie's context, but also the traditional Hollywood formula. We are now so used to big actions at the end of the movies, big or small, that this unique ending just pops. Being different aside, 7 also has one of the best and most shocking endings ever, the type of ending that makes you go back and think over the movie and details. It was an ending nobody wanted to film, and it was an ending that made David Fincher wanted to make the movie. And you can see, I believe it's on the Blu-ray, but they have an alternative version of the ending where what happens at the ending doesn't happen, which would it renders the whole movie moot. I love all Fincher movies, and even though I probably rewatched The Social Network more than any of his works, probably me too, I found 7 to be his best work to date and my favorite serial killer movie ever. It saddens me that Fincher hasn't directed a theatrical release in 7 years now, and I do hope he makes a triumphant return with his next movie, Mank, for Netflix. I love David Fincher as a director. I always talk about authorship. I think his command of cinematic language and his use of visual effects and the fact that he picks some of the best scripts and he is so precise. He's like a surgeon making his movies. I just love his films. I love Zodiac. I love 7. I love The Social Network. I was a little disappointed, to be honest, with his Girl with the Dragon Tattoo adaptation. Not that it wasn't beautifully made, but I felt that the Swedish version told the story better. I liked the storytelling in the Swedish version better. But I'm a huge fan of his, and of course that movie is a masterpiece, and I can't believe it's 25 years old. My God. But I look forward to Mank too. I think the reason David Fincher, he probably tried to get stuff off the ground, but the way the business works, why should a master filmmaker like David Fincher have to make the rounds? Why doesn't he said he wanted to make Mank, which apparently is based on a script his father wrote. And Netflix said, by all means, he was making Mindhunter, and after that, why go back to the studios and deal with people that don't know you, don't respect you, and don't believe in you when they should? Yeah. Here's an Ian Samuels letter where he talks about one of my favorite filmmakers is Paul Verhoeven. And I'm not as big a fan of The Hollow Man as I probably should be. It's got amazing effects work, and with The Invisible Man coming out, it's made me want to go revisit this movie. But here's our own Ian Samuels, he of Who Views on the Burnettwork website. If you want to check out his column, check it out. But here's another letter from him. Rob, I would like to comment on an underrated film, 2000's Hollow Man. Despite the criticism of this film, I believe it is a great insight into the darker side of a person if they were indeed turned invisible. An incredibly interesting adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel. There had been a number of adaptations of H.G. Wells' Invisible Man story, and they each worked for the period in which they were made. I feel that The Hollow Man is a really well-done modernization of the Victorian-era dark story. Kevin Bacon's performance, both at first as the arrogant, egotistical scientific genius, and later as the twisted nature of this man who is going crazy by not being seen by anyone, and the dark nature of his turn as he allows himself to indulge in anything he can do while invisible. It is an incredibly brutal film, but feels all too real. Many viewers, especially straight male viewers, are forced to admit that if they were in that situation, if they were invisible, they may carry out similar actions to those chosen by the mad genius Sebastian Cain. What do you think? If I turned invisible, if I was to be turned invisible, I don't think, I would become some creepy, voyeuristic rapist. I'd probably figure out ways to steal money and manipulate the stock market to get me more money, so I could finance films. I just think it's, I think it's not in my nature. I much prefer participatory sex with a partner as opposed to having your way with her when you're invisible. So, but it might be fun to terrorize people for a while. There's a few people I would love to go terrorize. Like you could get into the White House. Imagine what kind of havoc you could wreak. But yeah, no, it might be fun to be invisible for a while. Like I would love to go, if I was invisible, I'd want to go find out, like, are there really aliens at Area 51? What are the great conspiracies of the world? Can I go into the Vatican and go unlock the secrets deep inside the Vatican? I'd probably do things like that. I would sneak onto intercontinental plane flights, and I would totally travel for free around the world. It'd be great. I mean, I'd hope that you could turn. I don't know what it would like. I don't know how long I would last not being able to be seen. But yeah, I think the movie is a fun watch, but I wanted it to be better, to be honest. I've seen it a couple times. I own it, but I wish it was better. I'm a huge Verhoeven fan, and it's one of my. It's not up there. It certainly does not hit the heights of Soldier of Orange or The Fourth Man, or RoboCop, Total Recall, especially my beloved Basic Instinct, even Black Book. Or Total. It's just but it's fun to watch, and the effects are really interesting. So I'll say that. Let's see. Here's Calvin Bowles, our man Calvin in Oregon. He asks questions. Hi, Rob. I'm writing to ask your opinion on something. I'm working on a screenplay on the life of Clara Bow. When researching her life, I feel it screams for a film. Besides, she was also one of the sexiest women in cinema history. So here's my question. How do you deal with creative license without betraying the truth? Ah, Calvin, that's a question better men than I and better women than I have been asking themselves for years. For example, it's easier for her to have one close friend as opposed to many different people in a narrative, but in doing so, does that not betray the truth of what happened? It does. I fell in love with the idea of the life of a young girl who was born in poverty, abused by her family, leaves for Hollywood, and then is only abused by that system, and yet she still becomes the biggest star in pictures. She was a woman that, although she was the biggest box office draw in her day, the Hollywood elite would have nothing to do with her. My question is, still, how important are facts in this kind of movie? Tell us your opinion. Well, Calvin, I will. Look, no movie is ever going to give you the story of exactly what happened. And I think when you're doing a biopic, I think it's really important to make sure that the spirit of the truth is upheld. Obviously, you'll know that many people, whenever somebody's writing a biopic, they combine characters to make the story. What's important is the story. Does it embody the spirit of what happened to her? Now, if there are historical events that you want to touch on, it's always best to look at the truth. You don't have to make stuff up out of whole cloth. I don't believe in doing stuff like that, but you use a person's life as a jumping off point to tell a story, but you can't cram in every day of their lives into a movie, so you have to take dramatic license. And I've always thought it was best. Look, truth is always stranger than fiction. So if you try and skew closer to actually what happened, I think you're always gonna come out right. But yeah, when you're talking about if she has 8 good friends, maybe you have to combine those good friends into 4 good friends or something. But it's really up to you, and it's really up to the story that you're telling. And all I can say is good luck. I think it's great that you're going to stick with it. Write a page a day, and eventually in 120 days, you will have a finished script. How cool is that? So I am with you. I'm with you on that one. Let's see. Here's another one. This one comes from Chris P. Power and control in a bubble. Last week, I had some business to conduct in the LA area. My trip started in the largest and closest metro to LA, being San Diego. It's about a 2-hour drive south to north from San Diego to LA along I-5. You've famously spoken often how San Diego becomes the traveling circus of Comic-Con each year. However, during the other 50-plus weeks out of the year, it's not this way. Just a normal, low-key area full of medical research, military bases, beautiful beaches, tacos, and our local crowd. That's true. I used to go to San Diego almost every weekend, and I love San Diego. During my visit to LA, once reaching the outskirts of the suburban area of Irvine and Anaheim, the billboards of upcoming movies and musicians and comedians that typically headline entertainers of yesteryear start showing up. The glitz and the glamour, the constant lure of becoming someone famous, reachable riches, and that magical spotlight life is apparent within hundreds of ads. On my trek home down to merge onto a different freeway, the last reminders of show business were visible with a huge Sonic the Hedgehog billboard, which looked great when traveling at 60 miles an hour and Sonic is 30 feet larger than life in the billboard, and the advertisement for the rise of Resistance at Disneyland. While in the downtown, busy bees, multicultural people mixed everything, and life was everywhere. But I couldn't help but notice a bubble. Now, I've lived in Japan for 12 years, Bahrain, Thailand, Australia, the Philippines, and Canada for months at a time. My naval career took me places I had only seen, well, on the big screen. And even in San Diego, LA seemed to be in its own unique little world. True, LA is the mega mecca built upon decades of entertainment, which is why a visitor will see Hollywood's latest movie. Now, I'm just a simple guy with simple desires and likes. My wife is Japanese. We've got 3 little ones and one's adopted. I do consider myself well exposed to different ideas, thoughts, visions, experiences, and cultures, but even with all this in my life toolbox, while in LA, I could hear in my head other YouTubers that have not lived the LA life, except Nerdrotic to my knowledge, talk about the Hollywood bubble. And even these YouTubers that seem to be at some odds with the Hollywood social ideas. Admittedly, I've watched the Oscars and saw a sprinkle of how people should conduct themselves. I've seen these YouTubers bash Hollywood, and if you're not sure which YouTubers I'm referring to in general, then I would like to welcome you to the Burnettwork. There doesn't seem to be a reason to read the articles coming from Hollywood to defend movies or negatively talk about fans because I can hear the counter talking points online. Coming to a head, this leads to my pondering question. If articles attempting to defend movies that seem to on a trajectory of bombing are published, if actors and actresses, I'm not a fan of the word talent in this case, give speeches about morality to the masses for injection, if those with a voice or a keyboard in Hollywood have what's being viewed as an agenda, is there a real bubble in Hollywood? Is there currently a power struggle between online publishing companies and those we see on entertainment media against those outside of the business as preachy for topics that no longer affect their daily lives? Of course, I don't have an answer, which is why I'm asking you. And if anyone wants to comment after giving Rob a thumbs up and sharing the video, I appreciate you saying that. That reminds me, as Davey504 would say, slap like now. Whoosh. This trend of Hollywood versus fans seems to be growing quickly. Fans are turning against properties with videos of their own, a form of free enterprise, no pun intended, not watching film that hurts studios' bottom lines and pushing back against this unforeseen bubble. And this isn't a response to Sonic, it's been building up more and more. I could even say the lines were drawn in the sand since Ghostbusters 2016, to the major degree we're seeing in today's online discussion. So, in the end, could there be a building power struggle from those with the traditional voice out of Hollywood that maybe is in its own bubble towards fans? Are fans reacting too harshly? Those with the loudest voice typically control the narrative of life, so could there be a shift in control? Could there be a shift in control be upon us? Not that anyone's side or city is morally right in everything. My world journeys have taught me that what's great in one location wouldn't seem anything in another. Could Hollywood be desperately trying to control the narrative before it goes away? My 2 oldest teens couldn't even tell me the actor's or actress name in our beloved MCU movies, but they would be completely starstruck if they met their favorite YouTuber in person. The geek out would be adorable. And this is where the future power struggle of a combat battlefield is today, at least what I see based on my kids and their friends' reactions. To me, I see the future discussions of life, morality, incredible ideas, and spiritual guidance coming from those small devices we all have in our pocket from all types of life. That's all I've got for now, taken from Thor Skywalker. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic, Rob, as someone that wasn't born into Hollywood and has had or has to keep hustling to remain in this business. Does this mythical bubble truly exist? And as always, thank you again, Chris P. Wow, Chris, that, my friend, that's a large topic to unpack. First of all, I think anyone who is involved in the arts, and when I say the arts, I mean any of the arts. If you're a musician, if you're a dancer, if you're an artist, a fine artist, like my girlfriend Elizabeth, who's in school now studying to continue her painting, anybody who works in the arts, I think, has a tendency to be more liberal in terms of their politics and their ideas. Because when you're dealing with the arts, that's pretty much what you're doing. Art is a reflection of the society in which it's a part of. And I don't think that there's any way if you're someone involved in the arts, you're liberal, meaning you're open to new ideas, that you're constantly examining what does it mean to be a human being and what does it mean to exist. And if you're contemplating those kinds of ideas, you're not usually limited to labels. Because as an artist, you're always examining. Look, I used to hate the term artist. When I was at the Evergreen State College, people would walk around and call themselves artists, and I'd be like, fuck off. I used to think that you can't, it's not up to you to call yourself an artist. I always thought that it was for society to deem if what you were creating was in fact art. I've never considered myself an artist. I love filmmaking. I love technology, the technology that goes into filmmaking, but I love filmmaking, so I would never call myself an artist. I call myself a filmmaker, a journeyman filmmaker at that. One day maybe I'll create something that I consider my masterpiece. That day has yet to come. But I think that anybody who is involved in the arts tends to be more liberal. And one of the things about being an artist, too, is there are some places in the world where you have to worry about where you're going to sleep or the food you're going to get. People that, I think being an artist, in a way, we can't. I wish there was a way I could have given up my desires and just become an accountant or something that I knew what I was doing every day, and that at the end of every week I'd be given a paycheck. I wish I could have had a life like that at some point, but for whatever reason, that was not to be. So I've constantly been struggling. But, I think most people that are not in the arts are thinking about the pragmatic issues of life. How are we going to take care of ourselves? How are we going to take care of our children? Are we going to make sure that, the day-to-day things that we need to take care of in life are taken care of? And I think most people are concerned with those kinds of things. And when change comes along, if you're living in a small town that has had the same way of life for a long time, and your primary industry is, say, coal mining or manufacturing, and something comes along and suddenly your coal mine is shut down or your manufacturing factory is shut down or something, it disrupts your way of life. So these are pragmatic, real concerns that are going to make it maybe impossible for you to pay your bills anymore. Well, when you're an artist, you've already accepted that you're going to be living this kind of a life. I mean, anyway, what I was going to say is that artists are not necessarily by definition the most pragmatic people, and we also have a tendency to be more liberal, because that's what art does, is it examines, you're not, if you're an artist, you're not going to be like, well, I'm only going to talk about the people that I like, or I'm not going to, and in the arts, by the way, when you're in the arts, you meet all the other people that have been attracted to the arts as well. And they tend to be more, let's call them colorful or dynamic, than the people you meet, say, if you lived in primarily a manufacturing community that relied on a manufacturing base for its livelihood. So when you're talking about a Hollywood bubble, on one hand, people in Hollywood, yes, you can get it. Also, there's many different bubbles in Hollywood. Like I'm a production guy. I mean, I've dabbled on the side of agents and managers and all that. I have no interest in any of that at all. As a matter of fact, my experience have been that managers and agents get in the way of things more often than they help. That's not to say they can't be very helpful, because they can. But for the most part, I think when you're involved in making projects, you're working on a film for 2 years. The case of Tango Shalom, I've been working on this independent movie. It'll be 4 years in May that I've worked on this film. Now the film is done. We've moved into a different phase, which is now we're preparing. We're getting our ducks in a row, and then we're going to, in the next month, probably take the movie out and try and sell it. We've never been there before. But when you're involved in Hollywood and making these things, first of all, it's such a crapshoot. There's absolutely no security. It doesn't matter if you had a hit film. It doesn't mean you're going to necessarily get a job making a movie right away. There's no career path anymore that you can follow. And again, I think people have more liberal politics in this industry is because you're surrounded, especially if you work in production, you're surrounded by people, all different kinds of people that have different artistic disciplines. A cinematographer, for instance, incredible artists, painting with light. They know different things than, say, your screenwriter. And then they might know different things than a director. But you get all three together, and you have three different kinds of people that are interested in different things. A writer, a photographer, and a director, a cinematographer. And suddenly, you sit down, and is that a bubble of people? Is that a bubble of people because we don't have people in Hollywood that understand what it's like to live in a community that relied on a manufacturing base that suddenly went away? I mean, it's just, I think ultimately, I don't necessarily think there is a bubble in Hollywood. I just think that there's a concentration of a certain kind of people here. And a certain kind of people lean more liberal and leftist than other places in the country. There are places that I'm sure are simply far more right-leaning than there are in Hollywood. And, I don't necessarily think that there's an agenda here per se. I really don't. But, there are, like, I've met all kinds of people working in Hollywood. I've met straight people, I've met gay people, I've met people from every ethnicity, I've met trans people, and I've worked with all of them. And for the most part, I've had great experiences working with all of those people. So when I hear stories about discrimination, it gets my ire up, because I know that discriminating against people because of their race, because of their religion, because of their sexuality, because of their gender is pretty dumb. I mean, I'm just going to say it right out. It's pretty dumb. Because in my experience, when you're working on a movie set, a person's, again, gender, their sexuality, their religious beliefs don't really come into play. When you're on a movie set, you guys are all, guys, girls, whatever, gentle beings, you're all working to achieve the same thing, and that is to make your day. And everybody's, because they're on a movie set, are really good at their jobs. And I think part of the thing that makes artists good at their jobs is who they are as people and how they ended up coming into their profession, because they have something to say. I have a friend, I know a person that I've known for years who's a transgender science fiction writer. And part of her work that makes it so compelling is because of her own life experience. And I think that that's a great thing. So I love sitting down with people that are from all walks of life, because they usually are more flamboyant, they're more dynamic, they're more thoughtful, they're just more interesting. I mean, I'm like, I've always been like to everyone, hey man, let's all go and put on a show. What can you do? You're different. Like when I say every person has a story to tell that you have yet to hear, well, Hollywood has attracted people that have come from all over the place, from all walks of life, to realize their dreams of creating. I mean, what's really interesting is I've met very few people in Hollywood that are here because they want to get rich. I mean, everybody hopes that they're rich and wealthy, and I think everybody hopes that, but most of the people that I've met in the entertainment business, when you ask them, why'd you come here? I want to make a lot of money. That's it. There are other ways to do that. There are other better ways in most industries to get rich than coming to Hollywood. Now, I know a few people that have gotten very, very wealthy in Hollywood, and I wish I had a taste of their wealth. But for the most part, coming in and working on movies is such a pipe dream. It's such a crazy idea to even come here that, and everybody knows it. I think it's, in a way, it's the perception of the world outside that has imposed this idea that we live in a bubble. Now, indeed, I find it very interesting. As people that are telling stories, what are we telling stories about? We're telling stories about people. You know, in order to be working in the film business, to be a writer, to work on movies and TV, you have to also sort of be inherently interested in the world around you. And I found that the people that I've worked with that are here are some of the most thoughtful and interesting people that I've ever met, even people that have different politics than I do. The great thing about people that I've met that are, say, more conservative is they're also whip smart. So they can talk about their different beliefs. If they're, say, ultra conservative, they really can tell you why. And they can really argue their point of view to the point where you're like, huh, I really appreciate where you're coming from. You've made me realize what I didn't understand. And that's something that I also think is people are not giving Hollywood enough credit for. I mean, ultimately, when you're working in the arts, and I don't just mean in Hollywood, as everybody might know, you meet people from all different walks of life. And you have to be, by definition, a bit more tolerant of people and their differences if you want to be successful working in the arts. And I feel that way about Hollywood. Now, there's another part of Hollywood where people, you're obviously feeding your ego and you want to be a certain kind of a person. You want to be perceived as a kind of person. You want to have power and prestige and all that. And that's fine too, if that's what you're really interested in. But I'm not usually dealing with those people, to be honest. When you're working in production, production is too hard. And many of the people that I've tried to work with in the past fall away because they don't understand why you would sit in an edit bay for 12 to 14 hours a day working on a project for months at a time. Most of the people that want to just get prestige and famous, they don't have that kind of work ethic. And the people that do have that kind of work ethic, they're getting famous because they have that work ethic, not because they were looking to become famous. They like doing what they're doing. So I hope that answers the question. But I love that you asked it. I think that's great. There's a lot of I have a lot of letters I have yet to read here. As you can see, I'm very behind on my letters. But so there you go. Oh, you know what? Here's a letter from Jeffrey Mao. I haven't read a letter from Jeffrey Mao in a while. I'm going to read one now from Jeffrey Mao. And here we go. Greetings, Rob, and my fellow Robservationists. You know what? I'm going to hold off. Hold on a second. No, I'll read this. I've returned to the letters, finally. I wanted not talk about one subject, but a couple of things I have on my mind. I don't like to wade into the wokeness debate much, as it's usually a pit of doom that can never be escaped from. But with regard to our girl Padme, Natalie Portman's recent passive-aggressive statement at the Oscars, what can I say? First, it was disrespectful and in bad taste. You don't get invited to someone's party and then within earshot of the host, badmouth the host for not inviting more of your friends. What Jeffrey Mao is talking about is at the Oscars, Natalie Portman was wearing a coat, and she had the names of women, I think it was women directors that were not nominated, sewn into that coat. If she has a beef about actual or perceived snubs of female directors for Best Director nominations, then she should make her case. Is there a real nominee who could have been replaced with someone on her list? She has a list. There's no way for all of them to get nominations over the actual nominees. More importantly, she should put her money where her mouth is. If she feels so strongly about the issue, back a film with a female director. Produce a film and go out and hire a female director. Create the opportunities that she says are lacking in Hollywood. Next, with the recent string of woke flops like Terminator Dark Fate, Charlie's Angels, and now Bird of Prey, aka Harley Quinn, aka Margot Robbie's Vanity Project, I've heard this common refrain. All of you, fill in the blank for your favorite group, need to support name a film, or otherwise Hollywood isn't going to make any more of this kind of film. I only hear this with movies that aren't doing so well or aren't projected to do so well, and people get nervous about everyone not supporting the film. There are always reasons why a film succeeds or doesn't financially. Mostly it's down to marketing. If the marketing department for the studio hasn't done a good job of marketing a film, then the next best option is word of mouth. And word of mouth certainly has in the past accounted for certain films succeeding far more than they probably were initially projected to. On the other hand, I would not consider this recent tactic as being word of mouth. It's more like a political campaign where everyone has one vote, and if you don't vote, your vote is wasted, so use it or lose it. If I don't like a film, then I won't watch it, even if it's the genre that I like. I don't watch every horror, or sci-fi, or fantasy, or genre film, but why is it that I never hear people saying if I don't spend my money to watch that genre of film, then they will stop making that kind of film? I'm not obligated to spend any of my money on anything. Give me a good product, and I'll put my money behind it. If movie watching was like voting and everybody only got one watch a week, and whatever film gets shown the next week is based on who watched what the week before, then I can understand that idea working, but that's not how it works. With regard to the Oscars show and why it's good or bad or how to improve it, I have a few thoughts. I'm like you, Rob. I used to love watching the Oscars. I'd record every year's show. I loved it when it was held during spring break week. Me too, because I'd watch it by myself at my grandparents' house in Palm Springs. I used to love that. I look forward every year to it after coming home from college. I think the Oscars suffer from the same problem as sports events, like the Super Bowl or the Olympics. The broadcaster tries to create drama, tries to build up the show as entertainingly as possible, but since they can't pick the participants, sometimes they just get a bad draw. And there's always going to be people who watch, but some years you just have a bad field of Best Picture nominees. Some years it feels like all the nominees made less money combined than Endgame made in one weekend. You can always bring back the stars, but a lot of times they aren't nominated. A couple of good musical numbers spice up the show, just like a good Super Bowl halftime show, but that doesn't draw the audience. It's a quality of the game itself. If you have a couple of small market teams with no stars and it's a slog, you get bad ratings. For me personally, I felt like after Return of the King won big, the Oscars started to go down for me, and that's probably when I stopped watching recently. Then we got a couple of relative snoozers as Best Picture winners. $1 Million Baby, okay, but Best Picture? Crash? Enough said. We had a couple of decent winners after that, like The Departed and No Country for Old Men. Slumdog Millionaire, okay, I guess, never saw it. It's really good. The Hurt Locker, nice film, but Best Picture? The King's Speech? I could go on. Just a trend of increasing mediocrity in Best Picture winners. I had to look them up. I used to remember who won each and every year. Me too. It seems that nowadays whoever wins the Best Picture Oscar seems to win merely because someone had to get the most votes as opposed to being a massive consensus for it. I mean, what was it in 2017 when everyone thought La La Land was going to win it and they all started to go up on stage, but Moonlight actually won? My point is that the Oscars as a show can't tell Hollywood to make another Return of the King so they can have an awesome show. The Oscars is just a symptom of Hollywood and the larger film industry producing fewer and fewer bigger budget films with broad appeal that are also of Best Picture quality. Thanks, Jeffrey Mao. Well, you know, Jeff, I think there's a lot of truth in what you've written. The problem is the movies that all of the studios make, and now we have one less studio in 20th Century Fox, are no longer... Look, studios are making spectacle movies now. They're making roller coaster rides, theme park rides. Those are the most money makers. And now when you're dealing with a global audience, there is no incentive for studios to make mid-level adult fare anymore. Like, why do that? You know, even myself, when I was producing a low-budget direct-to-video horror film for Warner Brothers, The Hills Run Red, I thought that we were going to have this was in 2008, I thought we were going to have a shot they were going to make 10 more movies. We were the second one they made under a 10-movie plan, and they had made Return to House on Haunted Hill first. The Hills Run Red was the first original movie they were going to make, and I was producing that. And then following up from us was a film called Cheerleaders in Trouble. And they were going to make 10 of these films total. So they had 3. One had come out, one was being made, and Cheerleaders in Trouble was in prep. And they were going to make 7 more. And I thought, great, well, since we are going to come in and Hills Run Red will be successful at this budget level, they'll give us another one to do. That's what I thought. But then cooler heads prevailed, or maybe, unfortunately, heads prevailed. But they just decided to scrap the whole program because the studio figured, okay, even though Joel Silver is the executive producer here, why should we make movies in the $3 to $6 million budget range when we can, and they'll make eventually, I don't know, $20, $30 million selling on home video, when we can make a $100 million movie that's going to make perhaps $1 billion at the worldwide box office. And it just came down to, well, what kind of movies are being made? What kind of movies make the most money? And now, as larger and larger concerns, corporate overlords are overseeing the studios, they're not satisfied with making a $50 million adult-oriented film that might have Oscar potential, that might only gross $250 or $300 million at the box office. What everybody wants now is they want studios to make $150 to $200 million that gross $1 billion. And when you're doing that, when you're making movies that cost $1 billion, you are then limited by the fact that you have to make it a movie that appeals to the widest amount of people. That's why we're getting Fast and the Furious 9. You know, who would have thought that Fast and the Furious 9 would have been grossing those movies? I mean, Fast 7 is one of the highest grossing movies of all time. Who would have thought that would have happened? So the Oscars, by definition, have suffered because the studios are making less and less films that work at the Oscars. Unfortunately, because they're catering to their global audience. So adult-oriented fare that's coming out of the studios is few and far between. I mean, if you look what the studios were making in the 70s, all the best movies were studio pictures. Paramount making The Godfather, Universal, making Jaws. But, I mean, there was, whether it's Network or Dog Day Afternoon or pick your favorite 70s movie, Rocky, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was, and some of those were indie films, Samuel, Saul's Ants or things like that. But still, for the most part, the world has changed. The Oscars have been around we're closing in on the 100th Oscar show. But the world has changed, people have changed, the studios have changed, the business has changed. And the Oscars, remember, they were just an award show. And now, look, people still like to see their favorite movie stars. They will tune in and watch the Oscars as long as they're star-studded. Whether the movies are worldwide hits, they're trying to make obviously the Motion Picture Academy needs that Oscar revenue because it funds them for the rest of the year. Now they're going to have their beautiful museum that I can't wait to open. I think that's going to offset any losses they don't receive from the Oscar broadcast. But we'll see. The world has just changed. But I think, Jeffrey, that was a good letter. And it's just, you end by saying Hollywood and the larger film industry produce fewer and fewer bigger budget movies with broad appeal that are also of best picture quality. You nailed it. They're not. And it's just the world that we live in, unfortunately. Yeah, so let's check in with you guys over here. Let's see. Austin Hernandez sent in a super chat and said, Rob, hi, will you be my uncle? I guess I could be your uncle. Uncle Bob. I mean, I am an uncle for people already, but if you want me to be your uncle, sure. Love your show. What was the most expensive collectible you have, and what collectible do you own that you don't like as much? Well, I have to tell you, people are always telling me to sell my collectibles. I don't have many collectibles that are extraordinarily valuable. I have friends that are prop collectors, and they have props that are worth tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Most of the things that I have are not. I have a lot of them. I collect Hot Toys figures. I like Hot Toys figures. I really don't collect any. I collect 6 scale figures, and they're expensive, and some of them have gone up, past $1,000. Gary Beekler from Nerdrotic I told him, I was on a live stream with him last week, and I said one of the things that I've always liked about watching your show is looking for your action figures in the background. And it's funny, he has a new Conan figure that's really cool that he pulled out and showed me. But I said to him, I go, you have a Marlon Brando's Jor-El figure that was made it's from Superman the movie, but they used the Jor-El in Superman Returns, and that figure was made by Hot Toys back in 2006, but it was never released in the United States. They didn't have the license or whatever, so you had to import it. And he goes, I know, man, I paid $600 for it. And I was like, yeesh. But like, I understand that. I mean, I have one. I got it when it first came out. So I would say that I don't have many really valuable collectibles. I just have a lot of certain collectibles, but I don't have a lot of really expensive ones. I know people that have a lot more expensive collectibles than I do. A very good filmmaker friend of mine, for instance, recently purchased the Jupiter 2, the actual miniature of the Jupiter 2 from the 1960s Lost in Space series. And he paid more for that. I've had years go by where I haven't even made as much money in an entire year as he spent on that collectible. So, yeah, but I think there are collectibles just that I have that would only mean something to me. Like I have an Estes model rocket of the Interceptor. When I was in the 70s, when I was a little kid, I was really into model rocketry. I was president of my rocketry club in elementary school, and one of my favorite rockets was the Estes Interceptor. Well, about 10 years ago, they made an Interceptor E. It was the same model, but much bigger, and it flew on much more powerful engines. And, I have it. I'm looking at it right now. It's hanging from the ceiling over there. And I bought it and made it. And I love that. I love having that Interceptor E. It's really, I mean, you could probably get one online for, I don't know, between $50 and $100 if you wanted to find it. But, I painted mine up and made it look like it did when I was a kid. And I love that collectible. It's not, wouldn't be worth anything to anybody else. They'd, maybe some kid would see it and be like, "Oh, that's neat. Can I have that?" Put it in his room. But so I don't really have collectibles. The most valuable, I'll tell you what the most valuable collectible I have is. The most valuable collectible I have is a piece of paper, to be honest. And it's a piece of paper that my dad wrote. It was a letter that my dad sent me. For those of you my dad passed away over 10 years ago, but he was a great guy. And when I was making Free Enterprise, my dad was in it, and he spent the longest day that we were shooting on set. He played a character, Dick the bartender, and he interacted. He acted with Shatner, and he acted with Deborah Van Valkenburg. And he saw me working, and he'd never seen me on a set before, and he wrote me a letter about how proud that he was about my conduct and how I treated people and how I was able to run the set, and I didn't have an ego, because he didn't know. He thought maybe his son was a raging egomaniac and was going to scream at people with a bullhorn, but I didn't. And he wrote me this letter, and it's not a very long letter, but it's the most valuable thing that I own, because obviously my father is no longer with us, and that letter that he wrote to me is irreplaceable. And no matter how much money in the world I ever have, I will never be able to buy anything that means as much to me as that letter from my dad does. I know that might seem sappy, but it's true. Aditya, what a cool name. Aditya Singh sent in a super chat. Very nice super chat. Thank you. I hope I didn't massacre your name. Aditya. I like that name. Longtime listener, first super chat. Have a great day and keep up the good work. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate that. Sadu's Screening Room sent in a super chat and said, reading Dune for the first time and loving it. What were your thoughts on the script for Denis' adaptation? If it's anywhere near Blade Runner 29, I'm so down. The landscapers are attacking the Robservatory. Let me see. What are my thoughts on the adaptation? I loved it. I shouldn't get into it because I don't want to get another copyright strike. So I'm just going to say, actually, you know what? I loved it. I love the script. But I believe it was Robservations episode 235. It will be on the website. I'm going to host it on the website with my opinion as to what I thought of the script. And I think it's definitely the caliber of Blade Runner 2049, if not better, because I love the book and it's an adaptation of the book, and I'm very, very, very excited. Grant Kelbrick sent in another super chat. Absolutely brilliant. Terrence Malick is definitely one of the best directors out there. The Thin Red Line is a masterpiece. What say you about Malick? I'm a huge fan of Malick. I mean, I was growing up. I loved Badlands and Days of Heaven. And I've often talked about last year, Criterion released a different cut that he did of Tree of Life, which I think is pretty much a masterpiece. And he's been a little hit and miss in his movies of late. I really liked The New World a lot. I thought The New World was great. I really liked The Thin Red Line. I think the longer version is better. I think there's a longer version of it that, do I own it? But I like The Thin Red Line a great deal. I mean, obviously, Terrence Malick, he imbues his films with a certain sense of wonder that I really respond to, but I'm a huge fan. I want to see his new film that hasn't come out here yet, I don't think, but very much looking forward to it. So, yeah, absolutely. Mark C. sent in a letter. Mark C. he says, he sent in a super chat, pardon me. I'm not an artist. I am a craftsman who works on his craft. I find those that claim to be artists and not craftsmen enjoy yelling at windmills. Well, as you heard me say, I'm pretty much that way myself. I've always thought that whether or not you make art, that is for society to bequeath you with that title. I've always felt like, okay, I make films. If you watch my work and collectively think I'm an artist after seeing a lot of it, I'm like, okay, I'm with you there, but I don't necessarily think that I'm uncomfortable with calling myself an artist because it seems strange. But I agree. Being a craftsperson is good. I like that. I think that's actually really good. Now I'm going to read another self-serving letter because I can. Because why not? Because I like it when people write in about my work. This letter comes from Richard H. Hey, Rob. Currently experiencing your Requiem for Krypton documentary. I'm writing because I somewhat recently commented that I didn't realize I had the special edition DVD and I had not watched your documentary, then proceeded to pop it in only to find the second disc wouldn't play. Oh. Well, you commented report back, and so I felt like I needed to do so. Also, I've been wanting to check it out since I found out you did it. So I finally picked up a copy at the library, and I am reporting back. I'm really enjoying it. I'm assuming those are your voice cameos behind the camera. They are indeed. The meteor scene looked like it smelled wonderful. How was it to see it in person? It actually did. It did smell wonderful. I never disliked the movie, but definitely now have more appreciation for it. And didn't realize how many actual physical sets were used. Oh, yeah. Loved seeing Kevin Spacey get a head start on the little modern thing called texting, and that what's it like to work together bit got funnier every time. The recreation of Jor-El's face is also pretty incredible. It still looks great today. Cheers, Richard H. Well, thank you, Richard. So what Richard is referring to, as many people might know, back in the aughts, I worked on a lot of movies, not just the Lord of the Rings movies. And I did, along with my team, I did 4 documentaries for Bryan Singer movies. I did X-Men, X2, The Usual Suspects, and I was in Australia for a year covering the making of Superman Returns. So I made a 3-hour documentary along with the rest of my team on the making of Superman Returns called Requiem for Krypton. And that covered the actual physical production of the movie, of the film itself. And it just concentrates on physical production. It doesn't get into post, but it's 3 hours long. And I was there with a camera in my hand filming. And one day I'd love to do a 6-hour version of it. I still have all my tapes because there were things in it we didn't really get to do. And we were sort of pressed for time. And I really was proud of that documentary, but I really think it captures what it's like to be on set. and I really had a good time. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I'm glad you liked the documentary. I think it really does give you an idea of what I wanted to do with that documentary was I wanted to turn everybody who worked on the movie into characters. And like some of my favorite people that worked on the film, production designer Guy Hendricks Dias. I mean, the guy was amazing, and everybody who worked on that movie was great. I loved all the cast. It was so much fun. It was just a great year of my life to be in a foreign country in Australia, and every day, all I did all day long was go to work and document, and I could go anywhere and ask anybody anything. And it was just a fantastic experience. So thank you for that. I very much appreciate it. So yeah. Let's see. Here's a letter from Joe Foley. And he says, "Greetings, Robert, and the fine ladies and gentlemen of the Post-Geek Singularity. Last time I wrote in about my experience with Birds of Prey, which I have not yet read. Now I finish up my double feature movie review with Sonic the Hedgehog. I've been a lifelong Sonic fan. My earliest memories are playing Sonic 2 and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Hyperstone heist on Sega Genesis. As a fan, the journey into this movie was a roller coaster. When first announced, I exploded with excitement and possibility. After the first trailer, I lost all hope entirely. I hated the design and the feel of the movie. It reminded me of Alvin and the Chipmunks live action, and my hype for the movie became non-existent. Then came the announcement of the redesign, and while I truly applaud Paramount for stepping in to fix the problem, I still couldn't muster up much excitement. Good reviews come in soon after, and my interest was piqued, yet I was skeptical. However, as a hardcore fan, I'm happy to report I walked out of Sonic the Hedgehog with a big old smile on my face. The dedication to the source material cannot be ignored. They took their time to learn about the world of Sonic and how to adapt it correctly. From beginning to end, this felt like an origin story for both Sonic and Dr. Robotnik, a true prequel to everything we know about the video games. I love how they decided to ease us into the Sonic lore. We'll meet more of his friends and enemies as the adventures go on. Too much too soon would have scared off casual viewers. This is also a smart way to save money at the start. Personally, I think they hit pay dirt when they cast Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik. Even in the trailers, I could tell he would be a great fit. He took a two-dimensional character and made him a key highlight of the movie. A bit over the top? Sure. But Eggman has always been that way. The film is a huge win for me, but I do have a few nitpicks I'd like to discuss. First, I believe Sonic thrives best as a PG-13 rating. Darker storylines like Shadow the Hedgehog, Metal Sonic, and Chaos the God of Destruction are better suited in a more mature rating. However, they decided to go with the PG rating, and so far it's working for me, aside from some kid humor. In my opinion, Sonic is above a fart joke. But it is what it is. Secondly, what happened to sound design? In the trailer, when Sonic performed the spin dash, they used the exact same sound effect from the game. The same goes when he collects rings. They replaced the iconic sound effects in favor of something more subtle and realistic. They are magical rings. They should be able to make a magical sound when they're picked up. Nothing about this movie is realistic. You might as well dive all in. These tiny details could have added to my fun immensely. But if small sound design quirks are my biggest complaint for a Sonic movie, then consider me a happy man. I also think it would have been cool if they somehow hired Crush 40 to do a song. They were known for giving Sonic awesome rock and roll themes during the GameCube era, such as Live and Learn, Open Your Heart, and Sonic Heroes. These songs were a big part of my childhood, and I would have loved to see a new similar theme, but I digress. I have theories on where they're going for the next installment, but in order to talk about them, I will have to mildly spoil Dr. Robotnik's fate in the movie. Guess what? Sonic defeats him. Oh my god. No way. With the reveal of the Mushroom Hill Zone, the place we were first introduced to, Knuckles the Enchinda, or is that Enchilada? Knuckles the Enchinda back in Sonic 3, I strongly believe this suggests that Dr. Robotnik will discover the Master Emerald and its protector, Knuckles. Which means the second... By the way, I'm sorry for the landscapers. Which means the second movie will most likely focus on the 7 Chaos Emeralds, which fills me with geeky glee. I'm unsure if they will keep Sonic on Earth despite him finally finding a home. With Dr. Robotnik now stuck in Sonic's world, I wonder if they'll take the same route as the video game, where Robotnik enslaves Sonic's animal friends and turns them into robots. This would give Sonic a reason to go back to the home we all know, and with a bigger budget, I think this would work out well. Would this idea be too dark for kids, though? Only time will tell. Again, they should have went PG-13, but oh well. I predict Sonic's human friend will join him in the second movie and maybe in a later installment, return to Earth for the Chaos storyline. This is a franchise with huge potential, and I'm glad they sped out of the gate strong. I'll be fascinated to see what effect the success of the movie has on the gaming side of the franchise. I also wonder what this means for video game movies. First Tomb Raider, then Detective Pikachu, and now Sonic the Hedgehog. Are video game movies on a roll? I hope it continues into the sequel, but for now, I'm truly happy to have enjoyed a good Sonic story, which is something I haven't been able to experience in a long time. Thank you for taking the time to read my letter. Stay fast, my friends. Your friend from Chicago, Joe F. P.S. Do you think we'll ever get a cut with the Nightmare Fuel Sonic design? While watching, I couldn't help but think about it. Joe Foley. I don't know, Joe. That's actually that's a really good idea. I wonder if they'll put that on the Blu-ray. I guess how much money it's going to see how much money it makes first. I like that idea. That English gent sent in a super chat and says, "Hey Rob, I sent in my first letter to you today via your website, but I've just realized I called you Richard instead of Rob. I had just woken up, so my brain wasn't in full swing. My apologies." Well, that English gent, I'm going to read your letter tomorrow on this show, and I'm going to read it as Richard. No, I'll change my name. First of all, I appreciate you sending in a letter, and second of all, I appreciate you supporting the channel. And ladies and gentlemen, I think this brings me to an end. Actually, I know this brings me to an end to this episode of Robservations, the show about something. If you like these chats, please hit like, please subscribe, please hit the notification bell so you know when I go on. Love having you all here. If you want, please always go to the Burnettwork.net website and send me letters or send me videos. I know I've got some videos I haven't played, but send me all of those things and I will continue to play them and have them here on the show. I would like to give a big shout out to my great moderating staff, of course, beginning with Mike Bodden, the mayor of Riverdale, Iowa, who makes everything go and the website stays up and current. I want to thank, of course, Detective Jim Boyers for being Detective Jim Boyers, a former cop who walked the beat and then he became a detective. I don't know if he walked the beat, to be honest, but I know he drove a squad car, which is cool. And it's great to have him here. It's also great to have Greg Smith here, my old friend Greg Smith, who I grew up with, who's building a 1-to-1 scale model of a snowspeeder that you can see at an awesome Star Wars display that just gets bigger every year of giant 1-to-1 scale replicas that Greg's been building most of, including Luke's land speeder. And last year they built a probe droid. They built Priscilla, Queen of the Glacier. And now there's going to be a snowspeeder. I wonder if the snowspeeder is going to fire at the probe droid. I don't know. And of course, I want to thank Louis Yu and Jordy Lyons for being here. All great men. And I want to thank them for their ongoing time and efforts to make this channel what it is. And that brings me to what I always say, which is every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. And with that, as I always say, to all of you, I will be back tomorrow on this show, but I will not be on the John Campea show. And as I always say, I say to all of you, have a better day.